everybody. Hey guys, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. If you have not already done so, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification button so that you will get updates of new videos that I'll be posting. This is video number 2 in a series that we set out to do, shedding some light on the political situation in the Gambia. But to put it in context, we decided to go back in history to lay out the, if you will, the evolution of Gambian politics that got us to where we are today. We are all, anyone who is Gambian and interested in Gambian affairs and taking keen interest, or even a casual observer of Gambian politics, you know that our politics is less than ideal, and tribalism has seeped into our politics so deeply. Our society, we can say, is headed towards the brink of this unity, the kind of which we have never seen before. So in order to put things in context, we're trying to lay out a picture of how things were, how things shaped up and got us to this place that we are today, the evolution of Gambian politics, if you will. This is the second in the series. The first video has already been uploaded and it has been on my channel. Point of note, I would say go to that video. I'll post the link of the video below so you can check it out. The series will make more sense if you follow the narrative chronologically, which the first video did. Lays out the background or the foundations on which we will build the arguments that are going to be made subsequently in the series. So check out that video. It's an extension, if you like, or a commentary on the book that I published, Usurped, Stealing a Country. If you have not read that book also, I would suggest, or I would highly recommend that you do. The whole idea, the whole point of what we're trying to do is to bring everybody on board, to have us all on the same page, to enhance understanding of our situation as a country so that we can all contribute what we can towards bettering our lot. Being far removed from your native country, being hundreds or thousands of miles away in some foreign land trying to eke out a living does not necessarily make you completely detached from events that are happening at home, or that you shouldn't care about them. Yes, granted, some of us could say we can take care of our families, we don't need to worry about the political situation in our country, but these are our countrymen, our relatives, our fellow human beings at the very least, and we should want what we want for ourselves, which is a better life for them, for their children, so that they will not be perpetually destitute. And a great deal of what makes a society prosper is the governance structure, the policies that government implements and how they resonate and impact the lives of people on a daily basis. So that's the whole point of this. But to understand why we have so much polarization in our politics, because that's a big issue that cannot be left unaddressed, because if we do not address it, what is going to happen is that we, because of that polarization, will not be able to focus on the issues that really matter. It will always be some bickering, some infighting, some disagreement about everything but the real issues that are impacting our lives. So because of that, I would encourage that we keep an open mind and understand that the whole goal of this discussion is to bring us all not on the same page, because we cannot agree when it comes to ideology per se, but to understand that our situation needs addressing, shift focus away from issues that are going to further polarize us and destroy our society, and focus on the real issues that are affecting everybody, regardless of what ethnicity or tribe they belong to. So to recap from the first video, basically the Gambia was a British colony, and colonialism by definition is an imposition of values from those who dominate, imposing their values on those they dominated. But not unlike other societies that had colonialism imposed on them, in the Gambia also it was resisted. The first phase of that resistance was basically from the kings of pre-colonial Gambia. You know, we had these districts, what we ended up calling them, for example, Badibu, Nyomi, Kiang, Jara, Wuropina, Jimara. These were all little kingdoms that were governed by what we would call kings in our culture, in our tradition. So the first resistance to this domination or colonialism came from those native rulers. The most notable of them was between the King of Nyomi and the British, which was recorded in history books as the Bara Wars. We delved into that a little bit, but we cannot go into details because of time. We try to keep these videos as short as possible and packed with as much detail as we can. But the companion book, which is Usurped, Stealing a Country, which is the book that I wrote, is also geared towards the same thing, creating a context for us to better understand our country and our political history. So I would say check it out and have a better understanding of the Gambia's political situation. Some of these points that are going to be talked about are elaborated in that book. So the first wave of resistance was from the kings. Obviously, their rule was threatened, their monopoly over power was threatened, so there was some resistance. And like I said, the most notable of those resistance against British colonialism was the Bara Wars that was fought between Mansa Burungai Sonko and the British. But obviously, he was defeated and colonialism continued in the country. And the second wave of that colonialism or resistance to it was waged by the scholars or Islamic scholars, and we recorded it in our history books as the Soninke Marabu Wars. It is more than that. There's so much more to it than just the fact that it was Muslim clerics who were fighting to convert forcefully the natives who are still animists and traditional believers in religion. There was more to it than that. So we address that also as another aspect of the resistance to British rule. The final phase that led to our independence was the use of conventional politics, structured political advocacy. And the most notable of that was started with Edward Francis Small, who was basically advocating for the inclusion of the entire country in decision-making process with his famous slogan, no taxation without representation. So colonialism in those days was structured in such a way that the protectorate people who were considered British subjects had no say when it comes to the affairs of the country. They couldn't vote, they couldn't send representatives to advocate for their cause. They were just protected people, basically. And the colony area, which was where the seat of government was, they had some kind of representation, albeit limited representation, but they were given some kind of representation on the council, the governance council. So Edward Francis Small, being from the colony and working in the protectorate, saw the injustice that was taking place and started the advocacy for no taxation without representation. He was branded an agitator and all manner of things because that was a challenge to the powers that be. So basically, we would say the conventional politics that would lead to the ouster of the British colonial administration in the Gambia started effectively with his advocacy going down. So in the first video where we stopped at was the point where the emergence of the People's Progressive Party on the Gambia's political scene took place. So like I said, if you have not, I would say pause here and check the video, the first one of the series. The link will be in the description below, so you can pick up from there and continue to better understand what is going on. The People's Progressive Party, which ruled or governed the Gambia from 1965 when the country gained its independence to 1994 when the military decided to take power for themselves. First emerged on the Gambia's political scene in the late 50s, the very tail end of the 1950s. And it was originally set up as a protectorate people's society. It was a welfare association, and we went into the details of what the environment was like in the colony in those days, why people migrated from the protectorate to come into the colony of Banjul, or Bathurst as it was known back then, or Combo St. Mary's, which included Cape Point and areas around Banjul, which was the seat of government. So the situation that they faced, the conditions that they faced, prompted the need for them to create welfare associations that was geared towards catering to the members of their community, because they left their homes in the provinces, internal migrants, if you will, to eke out a living in the colony area as day laborers. So because of that distance away from their relatives and because of their needs, they decided to form welfare associations, come together, have regular meetings, and discuss any issues that are affecting them and see how best they can help each other to alleviate whatever situation they're in. So that welfare association became involved in politics. The politics was confined to the colony area at that time. So to get their needs addressed, they need some kind of alignment with political organizations who will help advocate their cause for them. But that was not the case. So basically they had no franchise because they're from the protectorate, and them being in the colony area, which for you to vote back then required that you were a yard owner, or you paid rates on your property. So being immigrants, obviously they didn't have any such rights to do or to have a say in the administration of the country. But their associations were active and they were working for the welfare of the members of their organization. So that was the situation at the emergence of the PPP when it came on the political scene in the Gambia. So the leaders of some of these kafos, or kafolu, because that's what they were called, these associations, some of their leaders decided that they were going to be foot soldiers or help in the campaign of established politicians in the colony to use their proximity or their activism for those politicians as a means to lobby them to advocate for the cause of the protectorate people as well, even though they don't have a vote, but to at least be a medium from their organizations to speak, to have the politicians speak on the afflictions of the people in the protectorate. So they threw their weight behind the different political parties in the colony area, but as I already stated, that didn't amount to much. So the status quo remained unchanged per se. So in essence, these kafolu, basically there was the Kombonyomi Lilai Rasuli Kafo, there was Kamben Kafo, Yirwa Kafo. These were the associations that existed, but they were all fragmented along regional lines to help promote the welfare of their people. And some of their leaders threw their weight behind different political parties like the Democratic Congress Alliance of Reverend J.C. Fay, or behind the People's, the United Party of PSJI. But like I said, that didn't amount to much. So that fragmentation was already there among the protectorate people themselves. But that would change when at one of their meetings, they recognized that some of the natives or the children of protectorate people have acquired some education and are now working in government. So they wanted to recruit them into their movement, not a movement per se, but into their association to help them with coordination and management, because all of them at that time, almost all of them, were illiterate in the sense that they never sat in a classroom, they don't know how to read or write or communicate their needs to the colonial government. So they were in need of people who would sympathize with them, who not only sympathize with them, but would have a shared experience as to what they went through as protectorate natives. So recognizing that some of the people working in government as junior clerks or junior civil servants were children of the protectorate people, actually encourage them to approach these people and co-opt them into their associations. So as fate would have it, one of those people that were approached to join these associations by virtue of the fact that they were native protectorate people, and this was a cause for the protectorate people, and they should help out. One of those people that was approached, as fate would have it, turned out to be Sandauda Jawara, who later became the first president of the Republic of the Gambia, and took the Gambia to independence and republican status. So when he was co-opted, according to his own writings in his biography, he did mention the fact that he noticed there was some kind of misunderstanding or disagreement or lack of coordination or unified purpose among the protectorate societies that were already in existence. And he wrote, after he was invited to one of their meetings, he wrote, and I quote, "I listened to the tempo of the meeting and realized that the rivalry between the leaders was the only trivial issue that was hampering the gelling of a dynamic movement." So he understood that this movement was dynamic, but because there was some trivial issues, they couldn't come together to form a unified association that would serve as an advocacy group for all of the protectorate, since they were all advocating for their own individual regions. So he agreed to join their ranks and worked towards coordinating and efforts to see that they all come together in one unified association. And so was born the Protectorate People's Society. So that was the outlook. Since they were a welfare association not actively involved in politics, their first outlook was one of a society of protectorate peoples. But as political advocacy was gathering steam across Africa and independence movements were springing up, and the fact that the Gambia still had that apartheid system where the colony was fully franchised, but the rest of the country, which is 95 to 98% of the country, was completely disenfranchised. The first priority of the Protectorate People's Society, as it was formed, was to advocate for the inclusion of the protectorate people in the suffrage. Universal adult suffrage was their advocacy. So with Jawara coming into the fold, and with political advocacy mounting up across Africa at that time, they recognized the need to use the very system that was used to impose British colonial rule on the Gambian people as the weapon to fight for the advocacy. So if the colonialists were obviously talking about rights and, democracy as it obtained in their country, civilizing the people, then the people need to have a voice. So that advocacy paid off. And what that led to was the extension of the suffrage. So every Gambian who has attained adulthood had the right to vote. So that was a huge accomplishment for the Protectorate People's Society. And because of this steam, because of the reception that they were received with, talks of forming a political party was also brought into the fold. And since there is rights to vote and, be voted for, the people embraced the idea of having a political party of protectorate people all throwing their weight behind it. So obviously this, on the face of it, looks sectarian. But if we understand the dynamics of politics at that time and understand how, the way things obtained in colonial Gambia, we would understand that it was not meant to be sectarian in any way, but to be inclusive of the whole entire country. So one thing that stood out from that time, one of the utterances that were used, that's why it's good to plant a good seed, because some of these things that are said end up having a life of their own. So imagine the fact that you were disenfranchised in your own country, and the British who came would find people that they feel are good enough to be your advocates, to be your representatives, and you have no say in that. You will just go along with whatever they decide for you. So in the heat of that, in the midst of that fight, and when the movement sprung up and said, we want inclusion in this, one way of expressing that is to say, we own this country. So if you say that in Mandinka, basically, isn't Bankot? So that was part of their campaign slogan, part of their strategy to galvanize the people to say we need to get out and support our own, to be able to have a say in our own country, or at least be the masters of our own destiny. So Nteletaminim Bankoti became a political tool, because until the PPP advocated for the extension of the suffrage to the protectorate people, the establishment politicians didn't care about that. That was a fact. Like I said, Edward Francis Small was the first person who advocated for no taxation without representation, because the people were paying taxes, but they had no voice. So if the PPP came, at the time, they were the Protectorate People's Society before they became the PPP. We will talk about that evolution as well. What happened at that time was basically exclusion of the entire country, while the colony carried on as normal, like if nothing else was wrong. So if PPP was the party that brought the franchise to the people and then turned around and said, we're going to now fight for independence, instead of just extending the franchise and then having the British lord over us, we're going to fight for independence and we want your support. Obviously, that is a threat to the establishment politicians who never ventured inland. They were just concerned with politics in the colony. The people didn't really know them as they were supposed to know their politicians and, see themselves in those politicians. So obviously, they suddenly have a huge task on their hands that they don't know how to deal with. All of the protectorate is now franchised. They can vote. And we have no structures in place for advocating for them to vote for us. So it became a threat. So when this whole call or advocacy, we own this country, we need to be the ones deciding its destiny, was used, obviously, it was a political opportunism was employed per se, because the protectorate was largely, extensively, a Mandinka-dominated region, because of the fact that there were farmers who tilled the land, and the region was heavily Mandinka. So because of that outlook and the fact that the colony was predominantly Wolof and Aku, that tribal card being played or being twisted to say, when they say, oh, we own this country, is a way of excluding other people, was used. So these were the times that such notions creeped their way into our politics. So if you're wondering where did it come from that Mandinka say we own this country, obviously in every group you have people who have a heightened sense of self, that they feel like they're above everybody else. That does happen. But that was not the reason why this phrase was used. Like I said, there was a need to kick the British out or to demand inclusion in the political process of the country. And the easiest way to do that is to tell the people, we own this country. Let us advocate for our rights. Let us be included in the decision-making of this country. Let us not be spectators who will just get fed whatever the policies the government brought, whether it worked for us or not. We need to rise up, taste it all, and then advocate for our own rights in this country. So if politicians decided to use that to say, oh, they think they own this country, that notion, that political attack line survived all these decades, and it's still being used against the Mandinkas in the country to say that they think they own this country. That's where it came from. Not justifying it, Not saying it's right or wrong, but if we take things out of the context from which they were formed, we can ascribe any kind of meaning to them. And that is exactly what happened. In his book, Enter Gambia, Birth of an Improbable Nation, Barclay Rice did have interviews with politicians of the day. And one of the most shocking ones, which people don't like us to mention, in regard to the fact that PS Njai is considered by some as one of the founding fathers of the country. But history cannot just be buried. We shouldn't be in the business of vilifying people, but human beings are flawed by nature. So there's nothing wrong when they made a mistake and we say this was a mistake, and then we learn from it, try to rectify it, not on their behalf, but for the sake of ourselves, to say this mistake was made and this is why it is wrong, so let us not repeat it. So in that book, Barclay Rice did actually quote him, saying that you cannot have an understanding with Mandinkas because all they know is groundnuts and farming. So basically it's like he had a condescending view of the Mandinkas, who were predominant or dominating or set to dominate the political process in the country by the extension of the franchise. So that notion of tribal identity was there. That distinct disparity between the colony's composition of ethnic groups and that of the protectorate was also visible. But as a fourth stage, Protectorate People's Society was an amalgamation of the different Kafolu. Kafo is the local name of an association, and Kafolu is the plural for those that don't understand the native languages. So those Kafolu were amalgamated to form the Protectorate People's Society. And when the franchise was extended and it became a registered party, it changed its name, or the name change was proposed from society to party. It became Protectorate People's Party. When they went to their first elections and they had a huge numbers in support of their political agenda, Jawara, being the Democrat that he was, and knowing that or seeing that this movement, he observed earlier that it was a dynamic movement, seeing that the potential of this movement is towards independence and we can achieve it because the country has our support, he suggested another name change from Protectorate People's Party to People's Progressive Party, an inclusive body that is not just going to be an advocacy group for the protectorate, because now it has outgrown that mandate. When they got the universal suffrage and they went to the polls and had huge margins in the polls, a huge win, they decided that this is no longer a protectorate affair. This is an entire Gambian affair. So that's the transformation from a CAFO to an amalgamation of CAFOs, which became the Protectorate People's Society. And then that momentum was built on to form the Protectorate People's Party, which was a political entity. And because of the successes that they were registering, they decided to make it a national movement to bring everybody on board, because that's what democracy calls for, that's what unity calls for. But that first seed was planted. The seed that, oh, they think they own this country, was a misinterpretation of what actually was being inferred by that statement, or what actually was meant. It was not even inferred. We own this country, we need to stand up and demand our rights. Any citizen would say that. It doesn't mean that any other person who doesn't speak my language, or because I said it in one language, means everybody else is excluded. But it was a political tool. The seed was planted back then, and it continued to germinate and be built on. So Protectorate People's Party into People's Progressive Party, they won to form the majority in the government. Just to cut a long story short, there was a whole series of issues between the PPP and the UP as to who had the majority and who should be premier and all that, but we will not get into the details. Like I said, this video is like a companion to the book that I wrote, and all the details are in there if one is interested in that. But the PPP became that party that would lead the Gambia to independence. It was formed in 1959. By 1965, it has already won the Gambia its independence on 18 February 1965. But here's the thing though. The people who formed who were the bedrock, the initiators of the protectorate societies were mostly day laborers, like we mentioned earlier, illiterates who couldn't read or write from the protectorate, trying to eke out a living in the colony area by being laborers, even not skilled per se. They did not have any formal education to be able to take over the machinery of government after independence was won. They didn't. So Jawara had to turn to people who had at least some understanding of what was happening back then, or at least happening in the government. And another thing that would come to play here is the fact that during at the height of its activities, the colonial government limited education only in the colony area. The protectorate didn't have access to it. Education was limited in the colony area. Any luck for the protectorate people would have been mission schools. Even the colony area, it was not government that was building schools and teaching people. They had missionaries alongside who would be helping people. Even Gambia High School was known as the Methodist Boys High School. So the Methodists, the Wesleyans, the Anglicans, they were the ones building schools, mission schools, and they were concentrated in the colony area. Armitage was also built because the colonial government needed the collaboration of the chiefs, because the British employed a system of indirect rule. All these things we probably learned in social studies. We will not delve into it for the sake of time. But the main point here is that education was limited only to the colony area. So there was further disenfranchisement of people in the protectorate. So because of that disparity, very few people from the colony area, from the protectorate, had access to education. Even Jawara himself was lucky that one of his father's friends, who was a trader from Banjul, Payoma, noticed that this young man has potential, and he convinced his dad, Jawara's dad, that he will bring him to Bathurst so that he can go to school and develop himself. And that was a good call. He was not related to Payoma by blood in any way, but people back then had very good relationships. Payoma from Banjul goes up country to trade or upriver to trade, became friends with Jawara's family. And because of the potential he saw in young Jawara, he convinced the Jawara family that they should let this boy go to school, and he brought him and became his guardian. And look what he produced, the first president of the Republic. They were not even of the same ethnic group. But that's how beautiful our relationships were. Nobody saw anybody for tribe. It was who you were cordial with. Education was limited. So with independence, the people who advocated for it, the foot soldiers, the people who fought for it, the protectorate people, were not equipped per se in terms of formal education to be able to man the positions that were now going to be ceded to the citizens by the British government. So what happened? Jawara had to come up with a strategy that we don't become a failed state, the improbable nation per se, by capitalizing on whatever resources he has that can help him govern. The last governor, or the last administrator for the British colonial government, he did mention that also in his biography, that he was advised to not be in a haste to do what was called Gambianization of the civil service. Basically, what he was being advised was that government requires experience. And if you're in too much of a hurry to say, we want to kick the British out and bring Gambians on board, it might not go so well because they don't have the experience needed to administer a country. So he took that advice, that wisdom, which was a wise counsel, he took it on board and retained some of the colonial administrators so that they would be there training Gambians who would essentially be their apprentice before they leave. So he retained those colonial administrators. That caused some uproar among Gambia's elite I would call them elite, but people who are educated. Or if we kick the British out, why are we still retaining them to be in our civil service? Gambians need to be in these departments. That's what they call Gambianization. But Jawara knew that was good counsel and he was going to stick by it. So that was one segment that was unhappy. Now comes the other segment that was unhappy with his next decision. Because the protectorate were limited in education, which is why this is important, Jawara turned to the people in the colony who were clerks in the government, who were educated or trained abroad as lawyers or whatever. The same people who were the political players of the day, who didn't care much about the protectorate, were the same people he turned to say, hey, we need to build this country, and these are the people who can help me, even though the protectorate people that back me up, the people that I was a part of, are the main players here. But when it comes to capacity and resources and literacy, we are very limited as to who we can tap into to be able to get what we need to govern this country. So he turned to the protectorate, the colony natives. That caused some uproar among the rural natives as well, protectorate people. We did all this fighting. We are the foot soldiers. Now, if you want to understand how that works, let's fast forward to 2016. After Jammeh was defeated, after 22 years in power as a tyrant, the country was completely polarized. So what happened? We know everybody in Jammeh's government was an enabler of that tyranny. But it was set up in such a way that if we decide to kick everybody out of government, everybody out of the positions they were in, it was going to lead to more fracture in the society. We had the likes of Langton Montamba talking about the security sector reform was going to target the Jolas. In fact, even before that, that was as late as 2021. Before that, one lawyer Dabo did suggest that we cannot sideline all of APRC, because what they're suspecting now is that if this new government comes, everybody who was affiliated with Yahya Jammeh or APRC is going to be excluded. And that was a good majority, because Jammeh was a popular president, even though he was tyrannical. And he ruled for 22 years. So a lot of people were affiliated with him. They don't want to see themselves as excluded in the new government that was coming. So right or wrong, the decision was made to identify people within that government who you could say, okay, well, they were all enablers, but there were some who were more, complicit than others. So Dabo recommended Abdoulaye Bojang, who was the Speaker of the National Assembly, to be co-opted into the new administration and made him ambassador to South Africa. That caused a lot of uproar. These were dictator enablers, and some even twisted it to say, oh, he was the only good Jola, because ethnicity and ethnic identity plays a role in how we see things in the Gambia when it comes to politics. So he said, if we sideline all of these people, even though we know Jammeh was not ruling right, he was not governing the country the way he was supposed to, tribal affiliation and all that, those affiliations, regional affiliation, played a part in who he chose to serve in his government. We cannot uproot all of them and expect that we would have a functioning government or functioning state, because people feel disenfranchised. They would feel like they're being sidelined or kicked out or targeted. So that was the intent behind it, but it was not well received. Some went as far as saying, oh, he's saying he's the only good Jola that they can co-opt into the government. That took on a whole life of its own. But not to digress, that will give us an idea of what was happening back in 1965 or after 1965 when the new government was to be formed. Jawara saw the need to bring people on board who, at the very least, could read or write, and had some minor experience in government. People who can be attached to colonial administrators to train them before they left and finally, left our shores completely for good. So they can have some basic understanding of governance and the structure of governance and administration. So that didn't bode well with the protectorate people. They saw it as a betrayal. So some seeds of discord were planted with that decision, where he chose people from the colony area and not the protectorate. But he did that in the interest of the country, because the country needed people that can serve in those positions and serve well. So that was what he did. But on top of that, when politics was heating up, because of what the protectorate people faced in the colony, there was some comments also, up to the point of people saying, okay, when we win, we're going to kick you out of your compounds and we're going to own them. That's all political rhetoric. It didn't, nobody was really going to be able to do that anyway. But it resonated with some natives that, oh, if these, Sosas or Sosai, these Mandinkas, because the protectorate, like I said, was heavily Mandinka, if they win, this is what they're going to do. So there was some element of fear from the establishment politicians or who were civil servants to see that their positions were threatened. If these people, with the force that they came and now they're going to win the government, they will bring their own people in. So there was that suspicion there, that fear about, insecurity, job insecurity. So when Jawara turned around and decided, you know what, competence is what we're going to focus on, and not, who brought me to power or who my largest political base is, I'm not going to be doling out rewards based on that. Just, we need to move the country forward. So when he decided to make that decision, some of them started feeling a little ease and a little more secure in their jobs. Like, okay. But then the realization set in also, oh, this is not going to last. We don't know how long it's going to take, but it's not going to last. So we will be gradually kicked out as they train their own people, like they're doing with us. Before the British go, they're training some of us. So by the time their people come, they will also kick us out. So there was that suspicion there. So what did those top civil servants do? Try to fill in positions with their own people, essentially fencing themselves in. There was that clear nepotism taking place in the civil service, in all cadres of the civil service. So what was obtaining during the colonial administration's tenure would continue. The same people would be in positions of power, and now that there's the Gambianization going on, they will bring their own people to surround themselves with and give opportunities to, so that they will feel more secure in their jobs. Or if they're going to kick them out, they will not kick all of them out. Some of them will still remain in power. So it was a whole tactic being played. And as a result of that, the protectorate people felt more and more agitated and frustrated that here we are, after all this fight, we cannot even get junior positions in government because it's all going to these Banjulians. That's how they saw it, protectorate and Sose Kaukau colony, Banjul Surwa. That's how it was. That's how the dynamic was. It's simplistic, but that's the understanding that the people brought to the table. So all these things were happening. In fact, this is not far-fetched. If we look at the testimony of the TRRC, one of the episodes that was talking about why the coup was engineered and, plotted, or whatever you want to call it, was the fact that there was a lot of nepotism in the army. Even the permanent secretary, Ministry of Defense, alluded to this. He confirmed it, that yes, the officer corps mostly was Banjul natives, and the people from the provinces felt like they were not being fairly treated. And if you look at it, the masterminds of the coup, the key players of the coup, they were all rural natives. From Ejame to Sanasabali to Basiru Bar, all of them, they were all rural natives because they saw that nepotism that was taking place. And if we go back to the records and look at all the army commander, deputy army commander, chief of police, deputy chief of police, operations and all that, and see who were in charge of those positions, this would be obvious. So it was there. It might not have been said, or it was unsaid to a certain extent, but it was there and people were seeing it. So that's one of the reasons that led to the coup. So the status quo was not changing. While Jawara was determined to see that the country could administer itself and progress like other nations would, because the Gambia was geographically inconceivable to stand alone as a country. So while he was focused on that, focused on the fact that we need people who are capable of moving this country forward, those same people turned around and thought, okay, these people who brought Jawara to power, they want these positions. So if we don't do something, we're going to lose it to them. So this whole Fankum thing started back then. We still hear the same rhetoric. you criticize the government, or it's because they want the positions that we have. The people who are in positions of power don't like you criticizing the government, because what it is that, oh, they criticize them because they want our positions. They're jealous of our positions, because government is something to be jealous of. It's not to be served, or it's not a position where you serve people. It's a position where you go to get titles and get rich and, you know, be the big person. We're still hearing those same rhetoric. So that was the case in the country until 1981, when the frustration reached fever pitch. Kukoy decided that he was going to try to overthrow the government, another rural native. That was bloody in 1981. But before that, Jawara's former vice president, Sirif, also formed a political party, and he knew he could count on the frustrated natives or protectorate people who felt betrayed by the composition of the government that Jawara built. So his intents were good, bringing people who have some basic knowledge, some training, who can help administer the country. But those same people he turned to became self-serving, trying to be more secure in their tenures, more secure in their roles as government officials. So that's how that corruption started in the government. 1975, the NCP was formed by Sirif Diba, and he had a large support base in the provinces. Not all of it, but in a lot of the provincial areas, like Badibu, for example, was assuredly an NCP stronghold. Even in the colony area, Bakau was assuredly an NCP stronghold. So that's how things were until 1994, when the coup happened. That was the second attempt at forcefully removing Jawara from power after 1981, and they succeeded. That's how Yahya Jammeh came to power in 1994 within that environment, because of the corruption that was there. But after they took power, there was a commission of inquiry. So when we say corruption, we usually think misappropriation of public funds. But even in that, Jawara, being the president, was probably one of the cleanest civil servants or public servants when it comes to corruption and misappropriation of public funds. But corruption took other forms, such as nepotism, putting people in positions that they cannot man, just simply because they are related to somebody who you know. So I'm pointing out these facts to say that the claims that are being made are too simplistic, and if we don't dig deeper, we would go along with it, believing in a false narrative, when in fact that's not the truth. All this talk of tribalism this, tribalism that, and Yahya Jammeh used the same tactics. After he came to power in 1994, he made a promise that they were only going to stay for 4 years. But because of the uproar that was caused, the Gambia was seen as a democratic country, an example in Africa. And suddenly here's a military coup, and what do they want to do? Stay in power for 4 years? The world's attention was on the Gambia at that time. So what they had to do was to feign some kind of loyalty to the people. Say, oh, we will go along with whatever the people say. So the National Consultative Committee was set up, and when they did their rounds around the country, they came back with a recommendation that the military only serves 2 years. At that time, they were saying we were going to go to the barracks, we're soldiers with a difference. So when it was cut to 2 years, I guess they didn't like that. So Jammeh had to resign from the army and decided that he was going to contest the elections, which was clear contradiction of what he promised he was going to do, him and his soldiers, that they were going to preside over a transition to democracy and then they would go back to the barracks. But he tasted power, so he decided to stay. And one way that he wanted to stay and continue staying in power was to ban all the politicians from the First Republic. They were all completely banned. Whoever served as a minister, whoever served as president, whoever served as vice president, they were all banned. And the Gambia being a parliamentary system, that was almost everybody who was active in politics. PDIs had been in politics since 1985. So by 1994, they were already well known in the Gambian political landscape, but they didn't garner much support from the Gambian voters. So maybe in the eyes of the APRC, which was Yahya Jammeh's military government turned civilian, they were not much of a threat. Maybe that's one of the motivations. At some point, they even approached them, according to Mama Cham, to see if Mama Cham was one of the leaders in the army. Said they approached the PDI's folks to see if they can serve in the government. So they had some respect for them. Maybe that was also a motivation. Maybe they didn't see them as a threat as well. But either way, all political parties, all political players in the First Republic were completely banned. The unexpected happened when Lawyer Dabo was approached and he accepted to be the leader of the new political party, which was the United Democratic Party, which in essence, like the People's Progressive Party before it, was an amalgamation of different factions. PPP was banned, so its support base was already there as the ruling party for 30 years. NCP was banned as the main opposition since 1975 to 1994. It was banned, its leader was banned, their support base was there. GPP was headed by Hassan Musa Kamara, who was Gambia's second vice president after Serif left government. They also had a support base. They were there, but their party leader was banned and the party was banned. So all these parties were brought together. They formed the United Democratic Party. And like the PPP before, they went in search of a leader who would lead them as the flag bearer into the elections that were slated for 1996. Lawyer Dabo was already a household name in the Gambia. He represented most notably, he was the defense counsel for Serif Mustafa Diba, who was the former vice president of the country, and he was named as an accomplice or implicated in the 1981 coup alongside members of the NCP, because Kukoy Samba Sanyang was an NCP candidate for the parliament prior to him taking the gun to decide to overthrow the government. So he represented Serif. And a lot of those 1981 coupists. So he became already a household name by 1994. People already knew him. So when he was approached to lead this new party, and he consulted with his family and they accepted, the UDP took off with momentum because basically the bases were there, literally. All you have to do is just have a leader and then just kick off. So this shocked Yahya Jammeh and his military gang. Here is a man who was well known in the country, leading a political base that has been in existence for, over 50 years combined. The NCP's combined number of years with the PPP and the GPP. They have a lot of political capital, so that was a threat to them. He didn't see that coming. So 1996 was pretty close. And he realized that I need to dismantle this party. And he was going to use everything that was within his powers. He thought if I lift the ban on these politicians, they will claim their support base and their followers and rebrand their party and come back up. This would mean that people will leave the UDP and go back to their former parties or follow their former leaders if they decide to form a party. But that didn't happen. So what next? He decided to use tribe. Oh, they don't like me because I'm a Jola. That's why. It's the Mandinkas because Lawyer Dabo was a Mandinka. But if that is the case, why would Serif Diba, if this country was supposed to be a Mandinka hegemony, or they have some sense of tribal supremacy per se, as they are accused of. When Jawara was in power for 30 years, his main opposition, his main rival was Serif Mustafa Diba, also a Mandinka. Dr. Lamin Bojang, who formed the PDP, was also a Mandinka, a rival to Jawara. PDI, as we mentioned earlier, was headed by Sidia Jata, also a Mandinka. And Serif's strongholds were the same strongholds that Jammeh never won in, Serif Divas, which was Badibus and Kiangs, Jaras and Bakau. But because it was convenient because the narrative already exists that the Mandinkas think they own this country. He was going to build on that to say, oh, it's because I'm a Jola and they think they're better than me, or they think they own this country. That's why they should be the ones who should be ruling. And that appealed to some people. From that point on, from 1994 on, even though in the First Republic there was these undertones of ethnic identity, it was deep beneath the surface. Nobody brought it up because there was no evidence for it. Jawara's government was almost completely composed of people from the colony area. To a certain extent, he was more of a hands-off guy, as long as the principles of democracy were, he didn't micromanage people. So there was a lot of nepotism going on, a lot of corruption going on in government ministries and departments. So to a certain extent, you could say he was complicit, but the fact remains that most of the people in positions of power were from the colony area. The foot soldiers, the political players or militants, as we will call them, were mostly from the protectorate. But, you know, what we call the Kunukumbal were all from the colony area. So you couldn't really accuse him of being a tribalist or anything like that. Nobody in their right mind would do that. So it was buried deep under the surface. But Jammeh, with his desire to cling to power, was going to use every tool at his disposal. And he brought out this tribal card. And people started using it and started saying it. Yeah, in fact, it's true. The Mandinkas think they own this country. And people grabbed on that. All because people said at the dawn of independence that we need to tie our waist, Teisito as we call it, and claim this country because this is our country. Somebody used that as a political tool to say, oh, they think they own this country. And it grew roots. Jammeh banked on it, capitalized on it. And shamefully, this current administration has made it way worse. The same tools that worked in the past, they're using it again. In essence, vilifying a segment of society just so they can get the political capital that they need. But as you gain that political capital, what happens is that you're breaking the fabric of society, that people who should be unified and see themselves as one people will start suspecting each other, will start hating each other. And that doesn't lead to any place good. So it behooves us all. It is our responsibility, our duty, to make sure that truth prevails in our country. To make sure that these narratives are not skewed, are not twisted and bent to serve a political interest of a few, when the majority are wallowing in misery and squalor. These are things that we need to understand. Our country is on the brink, and it's going to take all of us focusing on the issues that matter to unite our country. In the next video, we will talk about how this whole issue of tribe is relevant to everything that we do. The tribal identity. What does it mean? Why should we care? Nobody should shun their ethnicity out of convenience, or because I need to be patriotic to the country, so I need to shun. That's silly. Everybody is who you are by nature. That's nature's design. You didn't choose that. And you should be proud of who you are. So if people start attacking you because of who you are, not by choice, but by nature's own design, then that's unfortunate. So how do we use our diversity as a strength to move our country forward? That's what we will get into next in our subsequent videos.